I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Meghan Grebner. With us is Ethan Lane with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Ethan, we will see you in just a couple of days in New Orleans. Thanks for taking some time to join us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
As we look ahead to next week, obviously a bit of a busy week setting up the Cattlemen's College Monday, Tuesday in New Orleans, and then you get into the business of the meeting. What are some areas that you anticipate producers spending some time focusing on this year?
Well, USDA has given us plenty to talk about, right? Leading into this meeting, we've got a new rule on electronic ID out of USDA. We have a cattle contract library pilot program that now is live and being populated, and we expect to have some discussion about that while we're in New Orleans. Quite a bit of farm bill discussion, as you might imagine, but really getting into the granular specifics. We've got some policy proposals to talk about different ways to approach CRP, in ways that would better recognize grazing as a tool in those environments. Looking at the funding for the FMD vaccine bank and making sure that stays solvent. Talking about all of the different ways this farm bill process could play out, given the sort of hyper-partisan political environment that we find ourselves in. Never an ideal environment to spend $1 trillion or so on farm policy and nutrition policy. Nevertheless, that's the area we find ourselves in. So across our 7 policy committees that will meet next week in New Orleans, all of them have a full slate of issues to tackle as we start our grassroots policy process for the year.
I mean, really, the USDA kind of serves some of those hot topics up for you on a silver platter. Talk to me a little bit about that traceability conversation, because that's not an easy one, and that's really not a consensus view from one state to another on how cattlemen and women feel about traceability and RFID.
It's truly, that's one of those things that, it's been around forever, right? It feels like we've been talking about different forms of traceability for, more than a decade now. We have. This is a bit of a transition, this latest rule, away from kind of our expectation of where we've been for the last 2 or 3 years, coming out of that Trump administration rule where they had proposed a multi-year ramp up to RFID. This new proposal goes right to full implementation for cattle over 18 months of age, sexually intact, breeding stock, essentially moving interstate. And it moves away from saying RFID and says electronic ID. And that's a nod towards an evolving technological environment, right? We've been stuck on high frequency versus low frequency for a long time. And I think a lot of us feel like, we're arguing over technology that's rapidly becoming outdated, period, right? Whether you're talking high or low frequency. So this rule, I think, is intended to be technology agnostic, to leave room for some of that. And this is an important space to go into because, we know what could happen if we have an FMD outbreak, right? If we aren't prepared to demonstrate that pieces of the herd in different parts of the country are FMD free or disease free and can get back into the commerce stream quickly, if we don't have that ability, we could see an all stop that could be massively detrimental. It could dwarf the impacts of COVID on our industry. So this is something we have to take seriously, but we need to make sure we do it in a way that really respects producer privacy, that really ensures that we're not building a massive data repository that could be used as a weapon against the industry, and that it's not done in a way that producers are bearing all of the cost of this and none of the benefit of it through the supply chain, right? It can't just be, gosh, you should kick in extra money to make this work because it's good for the supply chain. It has to be a program that works for producers too. And we don't know that this rule necessarily got there out of the box, but that's why you do a proposed rule and a comment period so that you can put that input into the system, and hopefully USDA hears and respects that input and makes adjustments to that rule accordingly.
Ethan, as we talk about some of those farm bill programs specifically, obviously some room for conversations. As you look ahead, there's been a lot of talk about conservation and conservation programs. I know on the crop side of things, there's concerns about conservation programs being tied to crop insurance. Mm-hmm. What are some things that your producers are talking about in terms of conservation, but also grazing, and how those work together and what producers are doing to make a difference?
Right. We've seen such an evolution in how grazing is viewed in the conservation landscape. If you dial back to like the Obama administration, let's say, we still were having this argument over whether grazing was an impact or a benefit on those environments. I think we've moved dramatically in the right direction in that conversation, where this administration very clearly says and has said repeatedly, we have to have grazing on these landscapes. Grazing is a good thing. Grazing sequesters carbon in the soil. Grazing that's done appropriately increases those native grassland environments and improves soil quality and does all these great things that we need on those environments. So I think that's really where a lot of the focus is going to continue to be in these voluntary conservation programs, is making sure that not only is that really recognized in those programs, but that the tools are being put in place to encourage that in these different environments around the country, that it's easy for producers to access those resources and keep moving the needle. They're already doing this. They've been doing it for 30 years, right? Because it's the right thing to do. It's better for their bottom line in these environments to see those rangeland conditions improve. And we've seen those improvements. That's why we have this inertia towards a climate neutral footprint for the U.S. cattle industry. This isn't something that all of a sudden, 6 months ago, producers woke up and said, gosh, I guess we should get to work. They've been doing this. So what we're looking for out of this process is more resources, more tools to continue the good work that we were already doing in this space moving forward.
We've got a new Congress, and we've talked about this before, the impact that producers have when they have conversations with their congressional representatives or their senators is so much more impactful and moves the needle so much more than if somebody like you does or another lobbyist in general. What are some of the things that you want producers to take away from this meeting that they can go back and have those conversations face to face with when they sit down with their local representatives?
Well, I think really zeroing in on delivering that message to members of Congress that, there are a tremendous amount of needs that require these members to work across the aisle. They require them to get some deals done and actually get some work done. In this environment right now where you almost get punished as a member of Congress for looking for opportunities to work across the aisle. I think there's an expectation that because we're largely rural, and that means we're largely conservative as far as our membership is concerned, that we buy into that or that somehow is beneficial for us. So I think it's really important right on the outset, and this is, about the most political thing I'm going to say on an ag radio and ag broadcasting program, but it's important to remind those members of Congress that burning the building down doesn't exactly help producers move the ball forward. We have to have that collaboration, and we've got to have those farm state members really advocating for producer needs. And so, that looks different in Iowa than it looks in California, but either way, where producers really play an important role there is communicating what those are. If we go to a meeting in California, we're going to hear about water issues. We're going to hear about endangered species. We're going to hear about things that are really unique to those environments. So we get to the middle of the country, we're going to hear, probably a little more about input costs. We're going to hear about some of those marketing issues. And it's critically important that members of Congress recognize that while we're going to communicate a view for the entire industry from NCBA, getting that local voice and, hey, this is what's happening in our county, and this is the top of our priority list, is critically important. So never assume that someone else has delivered that message and that it's dialed into what you need in your operation. Got to take those opportunities to drill that into members of Congress every chance you get.
Anything else as we wrap up today? You're looking forward to, obviously, actually, before we do that, I want to go back to, we talk about like the networking and what you do and the updates and the meetings that are held in those policy areas. How important also is it for your cattle producers from Iowa to have conversations with cattle producers in Texas or other areas to make sure some of those policy issues for your organization can get worked through as well?
It's one of the most important parts of our meeting. During COVID, when a lot of meetings weren't happening, we were able to continue having our convention. And one thing you hear over and over and over is the term hallway conversation, right? And I know you've heard that term too, and everybody who goes to Cattlemen's meetings hears that. It's such an essential part of that. It's not replicated when you're in a Zoom, meeting or something like that. And we were so blessed to be able to continue to have the NCBA convention during COVID. And now that we're back to full strength, that ability to interface with producers from other parts of the country is such an incredibly important part of the meeting. The policy meetings are important too, obviously, but man, what a missed opportunity if we're not exchanging ideas about how you're doing it in one part of the country versus another, and how you square those two things up in a national policy platform. And for my money, it's one of the most important reasons to come to an NCBA convention.
Ethan, anything else you're looking forward to next week as we prepare to jazz up New Orleans?
This is one of our favorite weeks of the year for my team here in DC. We get to see some of our best friends from around the country. We get to catch up with folks from coast to coast. We get to really start our policy process for the year. And we get to do it in an event that over the course of a week has more cool speakers and great entertainment and things to do and see than you can possibly imagine. So we're looking forward to seeing everybody in New Orleans. We hope anybody who wasn't already deciding to come decides to load up the pickup and head south and meet us down there. And we're looking forward to a great week.
I will see you with boots on. Ethan, thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
You bet. See you soon.
I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.